Hi, you are listening to Mediation Station, and this is your host, Greg Fenton. Each week, we explore topics and ideas related to the experience of people with conflict and look to promote the profession of conflict resolvers. We are available to connect with at FentenMediation, Fenton Mediation, at gmail.com and at 647-227-4734. Visit us at our Facebook page to like us and Facebook group page to become a member. Also visit the YouTube channel called Fenton Mediation. Listen to podcasts of Mediation Station on platforms SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and on Google Podcasts. Please follow us at our Twitter account at Fenton Mediation. We are speaking today about you can handle the truth, my truth, of course, and that Julie Mckenna is here for conversation, and she'll be with me very shortly. We continue to present the program live each Sunday night from 8 to 9 p.m. through Zoom because there is no live in-person programming at the radio station due to COVID-19 measures. We will engage in conversation with everyone attending, able to listen in and watch. Microphones and webcams will be closed. If anyone wants to contribute, there are two options. One is to see the chat icon as a bubble at the bottom center of your screen for you to click to then type in a comment or question and click to send. Or you can click on the reactions icon that is also on the bottom center of your screen for us to see. And then we'll acknowledge your hand, and then we'll open up your mic only, and you can orally express yourself in terms of comment or question. The show is being recorded for both video and audio purposes and will be available for public access on platforms such as SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, and LinkedIn and Twitter, and I don't know, probably forgetting some. So let's transition to our conversation for today. Joining me for conversation is Julie Mckenna. That's that other face in the view here. You can handle the truth, my truth, of course. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Greg. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you being here. This is the first time doing it this way. You've been previously with me at the station.
You know what? This is going to be a big adventure for us both tonight, so we'll see how truthful you can be.
Well, what is it? Is it only the truth about me, or is the truth about you?
Well, I suppose that they're not mutually exclusive, are they?
Well, is my truth dependent on your truth and your truth dependent on my truth? Well, we'll have to have a conversation about that.
It's debatable.
Well, and maybe not. So what are, for you, what are your thoughts about doing the conversation this way?
I think it's a brand new medium, and I think given the current restrictions, I think that it's a good alternative to what you typically do. I think that it presents opportunity for various different listeners that you might not ordinarily get. Additional platform, they can watch it later, they can put a face to the name. And I think it also pauses reflection for the idea that sometimes through the radio, it forces you to just absolutely focus on nothing aside from listening. So with anything in life, I think there's positive, and I think that there's things that maybe not so positive. So we'll see how it goes tonight. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, well, this is like the number 8 show, I think. I've done it this way through Zooming. And as you say, it does present another manner of approach in communicating. People do get the, I'm not going to put the word benefit of seeing my face. They do get my face as part of this, whereas when I'm at the radio, it's just the voice, and they have to navigate that their own way using their imagination. And here it's less need for their imagination. They also get to see your face, so whereas they can't do the radio, that could be beneficial too. So how about you share some information about your professional life? Just be truthful about that, okay? And if you know what I mean.
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
So I work in the private sector, and I work in a position of leadership, and I've done so for the past 13 years. So it presents all sorts of different opportunities for me to examine the truth and examine different people's interpretations of the truth.
Where did the two of us meet?
So many years ago now, Greg, I was at York University.
Many years ago.
Many years ago, you were one of the
Yeah.
coaches.
Yeah.
And so at that time, you and I connected. I share your interest in peace and reconciliation. And so you and I got to chatting with regards to that. And then York is a fairly intensive program. So I got to spend, I think it was 8 hours a week, practically partaking in mediation itself. And you had the unfortunate obligation of supervising me as well as my classmates. So you got to see and offer us coaching.
Well, when you say unfortunate, I want to expand on that just a little bit, because it's fair to say there's an assumption that if you imply unfortunate, it could be perceived as being not so helpful, positive. Yet here we are, years later, still connected, and actually from reconnecting. So I think it's something really positive.
I definitely think it's
Yeah.
positive as well. I think where it comes down to is that, as you can see, I tend to push boundaries and I tend to seek for the truth and I tend to challenge expectations. And so I think that you've been lucky enough to have been part of that and to enjoy perhaps some of those expectations that may have been challenged and some of those assumptions that may have been challenged as well.
Well, I'm all about challenging the status quo. I'm not a traditionalist. I am, as I would identify, a provocateur, a agitator, and a disruptor. And, sitting in the background, helping support me with logistically is Laura. Laura, too, is a person who gravitated from that same program, maybe in a similar time frame from you. And so I think I surround myself, or whatever, with agitators. So getting on that concept of truth, what is it with you and the truth? As our previous conversation, I think it was in November of 2020, was titled Burden of Truth. What is it with you?
So I think that it's a pretty complicated question that you ask. And I think with the truth, as you may remember, last time I was with you, I mentioned that I believe it's important to have an objective measure of the truth and objective standards indicating the truth, regardless of what our subjective experience of that truth and our subjective reality of that truth might be. And so I think it might be fair to say that in today's climate, in today's environment, that there's an absence of agreement on what that truth might be. And I think that that may foster a lot of conflict and a lot of different situations that may be transpiring or may potentially transpire. And some of those can lead to very unfortunate outcomes. If we look at certain events that may have taken place around the world, we can see what disagreeing versions of the truth may enact in people.
Yeah, so when I say the word truth, Truth, what comes to mind for you?
So I think what comes to mind for me is that that is the absolute foundation of any successful, whether it be relationship or negotiation or anything else. I think it's absolutely necessary for us to start from a place of truth. Again, with the caveat that each of us are going to experience that truth differently.
Well, isn't that a problem? I mean, isn't my truth, if I was speaking, well, for myself or for any individual saying they're speaking their truth, isn't their truth the truth?
So I think, again, that comes to a fairly complicated interpretation. So I think that you're right in terms of that being the standard narrative, that a lot of people seem to think that my truth precludes your truth. And I think where we have maybe an opportunity rather than a problem is by expanding the dialogue and expanding the exchange that might be taking place. If we leave it on the surface that my truth is in direct opposition to your truth, and therefore my truth replaces your truth, certainly it's almost inevitable, it's invariable that you're going to end up with a conflict. Whereas if we can start from a place of mutual exchange, where we might do such things as ask each other, so such and such situation happened, what was that like for you? What did that evoke for you? How did that impact you? And I think if we truly engage in a dialogue and you start hearing and listening to what I'm saying, with the understanding that what I'm saying doesn't replace your experience of whatever the situation was, I think that it offers a lot of opportunity.
Fair to say. It's just that when people hear that word truth, I think there's a sense of ownership for it being my truth relative to another person's truth or version of the truth. That reinforces that whole positional perspective of people in terms of relationships, and it becomes somewhat fractured positional sides, we'll say. My truth relative to yours relative to mine. And I know we talked a bit about this in our previous show. And what do you think with regard to how people process that word truth?
So I think that it's very important to understand that words can be very powerful. And so by the example that I like to use is the temperature. So for example, you and I might both go outside and we both might experience a temperature of 12 degrees. But depending on what I'm wearing and how I'm dressed, I might feel that 12 degrees very differently than you do. But it doesn't negate the fact that the objective measure of the temperature remains at 12 degrees. So I think that by having a conversation that maybe a very different type of a conversation to understand what does the truth mean to you. And I think when you use the word truth, I think you're right, that it does confer an air of authority, that it is going to be an absolute and that it's either A or B as a proposition, notwithstanding the idea that there can be a lot of different influences. I think the truth, if I can use that word, Greg, is that things are a lot richer and human relations are a lot more complex than simply A or B.
Yeah, well, truthfully, I'm not sure how I can handle this. I can handle the truth personally. Like, I can handle my own truth. It's whether I can handle someone else's truth, especially in relation to being different from my version of the truth. And I think that's where we end up gravitating to this negative conflict sphere, where we believe that our truth is the correct truth and that another person's version of their truth is their problem and has nothing to do with our truth. And then we end up going down this path of negativity.
And I would certainly agree with that. And I think traditionally that's perhaps one of the reasons why we end up in these protracted disagreements that only seem to get worse and worse and more difficult to deal with over time. I think if we can start from a place of understanding, and Greg, if you and I can have a conversation in terms of me asking you, Greg, I noticed that you did this, this, and this. Tell me about that. I think that when we're thinking about the word truth, I think human nature as a general principle indicates that we're going to take the path of least resistance. We're always going to try and find the easiest method of proceeding. And I think
try to avoid things?
I think we might try to avoid things, but at the same time, I think it's easy for us to inject motivations. So Greg, you just mentioned that you're not sure if you can handle my truth.
Right.
I think it might be fair to say that you might be making some assumptions in terms of what my truth is and in terms of what my appreciation for the situation might be. And I think that that's the easy thing to do, notwithstanding the idea that maybe your presumptions are incorrect. maybe your presumptions about my motivations are not based in truth. And maybe that's going to challenge your concept of the truth. And that can be a very difficult reality to deal with, that perhaps we don't know everything. Perhaps we're not as competent as we think in terms of making assumptions about what the truth around us might be. And I think that that's where the opportunity comes in, to understand that the world is much richer than I think we give it credit for. I think human dynamics and I think human relations are a lot more rich and a lot more complex than we initially allow for. And if we're going to take it at a superficial level in terms of it's mine or it's yours and that's it, I think we stay in that place of negativity that you mentioned. Whereas I think if we engage in curiosity and appreciate the fact that maybe I don't know, maybe there is more to the story than initially I can think of, maybe that grants a great opportunity to enhance our relationship and to enhance my understanding and your understanding of the truth.
I hear you, and I understand, and I connect with many of the things you're saying. It's also where you mention about words matter and people getting meaning from words, as I'm also expressing. When people hear the word truth, they connect fact, from my experience too, with that, and that right and wrong. So that becomes sort of kind of a dilemma on how to navigate, and how do we give the space or provide the space, or do we even have the right to provide the space for another person to have a differing perspective from us?
And I think that that's part of the challenge in any relationship, is asking what it is our own agenda is. If we're going to proceed through any kind of relationship that we have in life, whatever that relationship may be, whether it be with another person, whether it be with our work, whether it be with whomever, I think that it would be incumbent upon all of us to have a richer experience in terms of what that relationship might be. And if we want to stay in terms of a transactional approach, whereas it's either A or B, that's a choice that we make. Whereas if we are interested, and Greg, I think you oftentimes use the iceberg analysis in terms of explaining that what meets the eye might be something like this, whereas what's really going on in terms of the motivations and agendas and past experience and so on and so forth, it might be a lot more dense and might be a lot more complex than we initially think. So I think it's important to start asking some questions of ourselves in terms of what is it that we want. If we're satisfied with something superficial, then I think we would also ask ourselves, is that reflective of the truth? I think it might be important for us to challenge ourselves, to give ourselves the opportunity to say that maybe we just don't know. Maybe we just need to be a bit more curious. Maybe we need to be a bit more confident with ourselves and our own personal relationship, to understand that somebody else's truth doesn't negate our own experience of whatever it is that we've gone through.
This whole thing of talking about the truth and giving ourselves this self-acknowledgement that there is a possibility of acknowledging another that could be contrary to our own version of the truth. That seems like a real challenge. And how is that factored into your work world, as a leadership person?
So it's definitely something that is a great opportunity. So I do tend to think a little bit differently than other people, and I do tend to not accept negatives in life. And I do tend to challenge what it is that people's common expectations might be. So I can think of a lot of different times where people have told me that things are impossible, that it's never going to happen, that there's no way, that it's just, there's no way to even bother, just don't even think about doing that. And I don't ever accept that. There's certain times, of course, where I have to, but as a general rule of thumb, I tend to be pretty analytical. I tend to make my own decisions. I tend to fact check. I tend to ask questions in terms of how a person may have arrived on such and such information. And as you and I both know, there's a great tendency for broken telephones to take place. And so, although a message may have started off as A, by the time it gets to whomever, it might be something entirely different than the messenger intended. So, in my work world, what I try to do is I try to set the stage in terms of having an open and honest conversation in terms of what it is my hope is and what it is that other people's perspectives are. I definitely believe that other people can offer absolutely great insight and great expertise and great assistance in terms of coming up with new innovative ways of doing things. And I think that's the only way that change can take place. And I'm certainly a firm believer in the concept that people have to be part of the process. If people are not part of the process, then I don't think it's going to have the success that it might have otherwise.
So how is really this whole topic or concept of truth factored into your life? Because, you know, this is our second conversation back and it's foundationally about truth. And then I'm going to make an assumption that that's obviously something that's important to you.
It is, yes, it is important to me. So, as you recall, our last show together was titled The Burden of Truth.
Yeah.
And so, I think that oftentimes, being somebody who doesn't necessarily go with the status quo and who may challenge different scenarios that may be around, by being a nonconformist, if I can call it that, I think that there is somewhat of a burden that is associated with that. It's not necessarily the popular voice to be a dissenter. It's not necessarily a popular way of going about life in terms of going with the flow. And I think that the challenge comes as well as the opportunity comes in starting to ask some questions in terms of why. Very, very simple questions in terms of why is it that we're doing things this way. So with regards to myself and the truth, I think that's where I like to start doing anything from. As you mentioned, it is foundational for me. And when I look around at the world and I see that sometimes with the strong propensity towards fake news, I don't think that the solutions that we enact, if they're not based on truth, I don't think that they're sustainable. I think that they may work.
If I may interject, though, the definition of fake news is from one perspective, because the other perspective believes it to be the truth.
You're absolutely right. And I think that that's why this conversation is so powerful. And I think that it is a topic, as funny as it is to say, that I think the truth is often forgotten. I think it's very commonplace to go with what the popular narrative is without necessarily challenging that and wondering about, can that fact of truth be independently verified? And if I'm to look at several different news sources, maybe I need to consider what the ownership is of that news source. Maybe I need to consider, is that the whole story that's being presented to me? Maybe I need to consider that maybe there's not. Maybe there's some very serious missing pieces that have not been presented. Yeah. And so I think that that is very important for all of us to think about.
So how do you connect truth with relationship or in relationship? How are those two concepts connected for you?
I think that they're very closely intertwined. And I think that trust, truth, and relationships are all foundational on one another. And I did have a professor many years ago that used to say that the power is in a relationship. It's not in a person, it actually is in a relationship. And that really does ring true. And I still recall those lessons all these years later, that I think our own relationship with the truth is very important. Some of us may be living in denial and may be very happy to be staying in the place that we're in, whereas I think it's very important for us to be objective in terms of measuring how it is that trust, truth, and relationships all commingle with one another.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up about that other 5-letter word, because we're talking about 5-letter word truth.
Yes.
The other 5-letter word that I would directly link and connect is trust with truth. And especially then fundamentally with relationships, truth, trust, and relationships. That sounds like a great opportunity, yet at the same time, it becomes a challenge to keep the truth, trust in the relationship. Your thoughts?
You're right. I think it is. And I think that depending on the depth of trust in that relationship, I think that it can withstand just about anything, assuming that the trust has been invested and the truth has been invested, and that everyone is on the same page, understanding that we all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. I think that that's foundational for us to remember as well. And I think that that's a very good starting place for us all to work from.
Then why do people see their truth as being the right or correct truth relative to seeing the other person's truth as being almost like an attack on them and of their truth? It becomes so problematic and positional and sides and adversarial.
You're right. And I think that that's the most common experience that most of us might have. And I think that where that comes from is that I think that's the easiest path to take. I think that it's very common for us to inject the motivations of what somebody else may be thinking. Greg, let's say you and I are having a disagreement in terms of what the truth might be. It would be very easy for me to hypothesize in terms of why you've done whatever it is that you've done, rather than simply explaining to you, Greg, when you did this, this is how it impacted me. I wanted to understand, what were your motivations in partaking in whatever it is that you did? By doing that, it takes a lot more trust, and it takes a lot more depth, and it takes a lot more time, and it forces me to be a little bit more open-minded than I would ordinarily be. But I think we're almost hardwired, pre-programmed as humans to just take the path of least resistance, to take the easiest way. And I think the easiest way is for me to assume that I know why you've done what you've done, and whatever truth it is, that I'm right and you're wrong. And I think that that's where we encounter a lot of difficulty. And I think that that's where we may even compromise relationships, by each of us assuming that we know what the motivations of the other person were.
And I think this is where the concepts of reaction relative to response also are part of this equation, this whole conversation. Because when people tend to, quote, react, it's more spontaneous, the absence of reflection or thinking about what just happened to see what didn't happen, to then make a more informed, intentional next step. And people are just, with the reaction, more emotionally based and spontaneous, and say things sometimes later on that they regret having said or done in that moment. And so when they hear the word whatever expressed by another person, and then they quickly identify that's sort of contrary to my truth, and it's a threat to my truth, and they tend to react. And the emotional based is not always the best way of dealing with things.
I think you're right. And I think that leads to a lot of entanglement. And I think it's also a distraction from whatever might truly be going on. Because rather than focusing on whatever the truth might be, I think we're focused on, as you said, reacting and assuming that we know what the motivation of the other person was. So sometimes I think it's important to remember that we inject our own thoughts and our own agenda on other people. I think we're kinder to ourselves than we are to other people. So Greg, human nature would typically dictate that if you've done something to me, I would judge you fairly harshly. And I would think that you've done whatever it is because of whatever judgments that I can come up with. Whereas if I did that, I may be a lot kinder to myself. I might think, well, I've been very overworked. I've been very stressed. It's COVID. It's a difficult environment. I've been very tired and all these other things that are going on. So I'll be much kinder to myself when making my own judgments about myself than I may be with you, which it's an unconscious bias, but it is also very dangerous for us. And I think it's important to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah, and in addition to be mindful, it's to be mindful that there is a tendency to process these moments in a lot of emotional charged ways that are not necessarily the most healthy or productive and do have their negative consequences and impacts. And you're equipped with the self-awareness that I'll say that you have. Uh, that's external. You have to identify that for yourself. You're a reflective person, so you're going to process your moments and you're going to make a thought informing step as your next step for the most part. And I say the most part because, I know you in a certain light, you know me in a certain light. We don't know each other in the broader perspective or the deeper. Though, of course, we have a connection, and that's why we have these conversations. And I value them, and I appreciate what you're saying. The thing is that other people hearing this stuff will say, well, really, that's all talk. How do you actually put that into action? Because to provide the space, the consideration of another takes effort, as you mentioned earlier too. Takes time. It is an investment by us. And we have to feel value in the relationship to invest in it, I believe.
I would agree with you. And I think that it's a very complicated situation that you mentioned. And I think that sometimes people mistake what value might be. And I think that sometimes people mistake how their own actions may impact somebody else's perceptions of value. And so I think that it's definitely an opportunity to encourage somebody to become more self-aware and to become more mindful of the fact that value is important. And everyone is going to contribute much greater to a conversation when they feel valued and when they feel that there is trust and when they feel that they are worth making the investment in terms of having that difficult conversation as it may be. And I think that sometimes where people struggle is, you mentioned earlier about being tangled in the emotions, and I think you're right. I think that sometimes emotions can get the best of us, and I think that we can get tangled and distracted in terms of focusing on the emotion rather than the true situation that's at hand. So in terms of encouraging people to put what we're talking about in theory into actual practice, I think the first step would be by being aware and by being mindful of the concepts that it's going to be difficult. It's not something easy that you and I are discussing tonight. And at the same time, it is definitely an opportunity. We can choose to maintain our superficial relationships as they may be, or we can make the investment and we can take it one step at a time and foster perhaps being a lot more in terms of complexity, in terms of investment, in terms of mutual exchange, in terms of discussing how it is that something may have impacted you versus how you may have reacted and how your reaction may have impacted somebody else. And so with all of these things that we're talking about, I can very much appreciate that they sound very much theoretical, but in practice, they can definitely have a lot of implications where it comes to fostering that relationship, to take it to future situations that may have to deal with even more complex, more difficult situations that have been dealt with in the past. And by making that investment and by putting in that effort and by cultivating that mutual exchange, I think that that lays the groundwork for doing the impossible.
It just seems like it takes so much effort and time to invest in getting the truth or having the truth or maintaining the truth. And it's so much easier to just deal with things as whatever and not clarify whether, what you're saying is connect truth with honesty or genuine or acting in good faith. It just seems that as human beings, we have this tendency to take the shortcut, the quick route to deal with our moments.
And I would agree with you. And I would ask another question, and that would be, I think it would require a lot of self-reflection. So for example, are we satisfied with living in that way? Are we satisfied? Because I can think of a lot of conversations that I happen to hear where people are not satisfied. They're not content with whatever the situation might be. And they don't realize the great power that they have in their own hands. And they're constantly thinking, oh, well, this person has done this and this has happened and so on and so forth. And it's a lot easier to cast blame and express our hurt by what other people have done to us, rather than recognizing that there's a very, very, very strong set of power that we hold in our own two hands. And that involves looking in the mirror and realizing that maybe we need to enact some changes in our own self, and maybe we need to look at not being superficial, as you mentioned, Greg, in terms of taking the easy way. Maybe we need to invest some of that energy rather than complaining about the negative in terms of doing something constructive on ourselves. Maybe we need to change our own maladaptive tendencies in terms of looking at what can I do differently? How can I contribute to a more productive, more constructive conversation? Rather than just simply looking at other people and saying other people are horrendous and they're terrible and you just can't deal with that person. I think that is an easy thing to do as well. I think the difficult thing to do is to look at ourselves and think, what can I do differently? What is it that's in my locus of control that I can start thinking of? What sort of impact I'm having on other people? And I think one of the things that's important to remember as well is that in terms of this easy path that we take, Greg, sometimes it's the path of least resistance to carry on doing things the way that we've always done them. But if we're not satisfied and if we're not happy with it, we have to be mindful of the fact that if nothing changes, nothing changes. And as cliche as that is, it's true.
Well, even when we say nothing changes, I have this feeling and experience that actually it is changing. So if we see it as negative and we say, well, that's how it was before, I would say that it's actually in a more negative manner, tone, depth, because if the negativity is continued from whatever earlier point to the current point, it's become even more entrenched and more problematic. So in my understanding of things, that would be a change, not a positive change. It's a negative change of reinforcing what already wasn't working well. And it becomes harder to intersect ourselves in those moments to try to make sense of it, to create something hopefully more hopeful that will go along the path to something better.
I think you're right. I think that you're absolutely right.
Are you being truthful with me?
I'm trying to be.
Well,
Are
don't
you receptive
try.
to that?
Well, I'm open to it. It's just what I really value is you being truthful for yourself, as I do promote for each person to be truthful for themselves. Because I think when we really walk our talk and become our ideal to put into action, because our minds are one thing, we think about things. The next is to do something about it. And that's the concept that I like to really push, which is the social change. It starts with the thinking, and then it says, what do I do with the thinking? Let's create a plan of making the change and transforming things.
And how has that worked for you, Greg?
I'm still working on it, It's a continuum. And, as you mentioned too for yourself, you're a person who looks to create. You're not a person who looks to follow, per se. You walk in your own shadow, if you want to call it. You create your shadow. You don't walk in the shadow of someone else. And I think that's what you value, and that's how you feel as an independent-minded person and an independent practicing person. That's your power when you can walk the talk, talk the walk, etc. be true to oneself, yourself, and that's what I promote.
And I think it's important to remember that everything that we do, there's a time and a place. And sometimes we do have to walk in the shadows of others, and sometimes we have to be the leader. And I think that's the balance of life. As I mentioned earlier, it's complex, it's rich, I think it's a lot more transformative than we give it credit for. But I think personally, I really value being open-minded, and I really value being able to have a conversation with somebody about something that may be completely abstract in terms of just generating ideas and just brainstorming and just kind of stepping outside of the normal day-to-day, normal mode of action in terms of the way that we standardly do things. And I think that there's great power in terms of just understanding that we're not committing to something just simply because we're discussing it. We're simply brainstorming. We're simply coming up with different alternatives, and we're simply coming up with ideas. And I think that I have to balance that, Greg, in the sense that it's another natural human tendency for people to resist change. People want to stay in the same situation because they're predictable. They know how to behave in a particular scenario, regardless of how negative it may be. They know how to conduct themselves. They know how to deal with some situation that may have been going on in their life for all these years. They may not believe that there's another way, and that there's something that can change, and that there's something that can be done to improve whatever scenario this person may be dealing with. And I think that it's important to remember that by being open and by being receptive to the idea that there are alternatives, that offers
or the word I use, options.
Options, very good word. That there are options and alternatives to doing things in the predictable way that we've always done things. If we carry on doing things in that predictable way, we're of course going to end up with the same results. If we're dissatisfied with whatever it is that we're dealing with, it's going to require that we're going to do something differently, or we're going to be receptive to doing something differently, or we're going to start by taking one small step in terms of being perhaps slightly more open-minded than we may have otherwise been.
Yes, I think the curiosity we talk a lot about in the work in terms of conflict, etc. I think it starts at an earlier point, which is the mindset of openness. Because if we're not curious, if we are not curious, we are thinking that, well, we may know it all, and there's nothing else for us to learn. And so there's no consideration for another, and that there's difference. And from difference, there's opportunity. So the openness concept is fundamental from my thinking and practice that goes to curiosity, that then goes into, okay, what's working, what's not working, why is it working, why is it not working, and then to try to generate some possibilities to then see about what is an option, and then try something, put it into play. The actions speak louder than words, because if you just keep all that stuff in your head, what's the point there? So how have you seen, leading into COVID, how has truthfulness or the truth affected COVID, or how have they affected each other?
Where would I begin, Greg?
Oh, one word at a time?
So the truth is that I think that COVID has really called into focus the polarization that we all face. And so I look around at society fairly often with regards specifically to COVID, and I find it very interesting that we're all privy to the same facts and the same sources and the same information and the same, I'm going to call it reality, yet we all have such a starkly different interpretation of that. There are individuals, as we know, that are COVID deniers, that are anti-maskers, that are protesters, that believe that this is a very big conspiracy, that this is a manufactured event that is seeking to control and eliminate any of our free choice and all of our freedoms, and so on and so forth. And then there are other individuals that are moderately inconvenienced by the fact that now we're required to be wearing masks, and that there are limitations in terms of what it is that we're able to do with our freedoms. And then there are other individuals that are extremely frightened, that are not leaving their house. Maybe it's health conditions that they may have, or whatever the situation may be. So all of us are living in this same reality, yet our interpretation of the facts are so different. And one of the things that you and I have spoken of briefly in the past, Greg, is the concept of a confirmation bias. So whatever it is that I believe to be my truth, I'm going to seek evidence to confirm whatever it is that I happen to believe. And whatever it happens to be that may challenge or may rebut some of my thoughts, my natural tendency is going to be to dismiss those as fake news or irrelevant or agenda-driven or something that is untrue. And so when it comes time to COVID, I think it really highlighted for me that internationally, we are looking at the same facts, and yet we're arriving at these starkly different interpretations. And what I find even more interesting is if we look at the 1918 pandemic with the Spanish flu, that a lot of what it is that we're facing today, we're repeating some of the situations that happened back in 1918. So I find that incredibly compelling.
In a way, quickly, what does that say to you about human nature or humankind or people?
I suppose at its most elemental that we're all individuals, that we're all going to interpret facts according to our own perspective.
Regardless of what information is out there.
The way that we interpret that information, I think, is going to
Right.
dictate the conclusions that we come to. So even if you and I are looking at the same thing, we may come up with starkly different interpretations and take starkly different actions based on that.
Right, for sure. So what do you think if we could just abandon the idea of being truthful in a relationship?
I'm not sure where that would leave anyone. I can't even imagine. I can think of a situation where I think there was a great absence of truth, and I don't think it ended well. So I don't think that would be advisable.
I think we could have another show on that, another conversation. So yeah, for sure. So what effect has our conversation? This is the second one in a different sort of stream on truth. What has this had on you in terms of any impact or not?
I think it recalls my commitment to being open and being curious and making sure that I'm self-aware when it comes time to being mindful of the fact that my truth is not necessarily the only truth, and understanding that everyone is going to have their own experience in terms of how it is that they interpret whatever it is that's around them. And the two of us can go through the exact same scenario, yet we may come out entirely differently. So I think by having this conversation about truth, it really reconfirms for me my interest in being curious, and by being open, and by being mindful of the others that are around me, and in terms of their truth as well.
Well, it sounds like, it's important for you in terms of consideration of another, that we don't walk in silos. We do walk as individuals, though we have relationships and we connect with each other in different levels and different manners. And that is something you value, as I do too. And I think that's important for us if we want to have productive, healthy worlds and societies overall, that we not walk as zombies in absence of foresight and forethought and purpose and intention with our moments. So how can people see that they have opportunities, which to me is about the future, when they focus on much of whether something that's happened which is truthful, that's really about the past.
So I think it's important to remember that when we are talking about that relationship between the past, the present, and the future, that they are all connected. And I think that perhaps what's at the forefront of that is our relationship with the past, the present, and the future in terms of what it is that our goals are. And I think a very strong place to start from is by being mindful in terms of how it is that we ourselves are having an impact on the people around us, on the events that are around us, and on the situations that are around us. And by forecasting our goals, by being mindful of how it is that we're maybe influencing all of what you've described, I think that's probably the best place to start from.
So you have any suggestions, or what suggestions can you provide for people to create a culture of truth in their relationship?
So I think, as simple as it sounds, I would suggest that by being open, by being mindful of the concept that one person's truth does not diminish or replace another person's interpretation and or experience of that truth, that two people can go through the exact same situation, the exact same conflict, and have completely different expressions of that. That there is so much richness. Greg, you just described that we all have pasts as well, that certain things in our past may influence how it is that we're seeing the truth in terms of what it is that we're looking at. So I think by being curious and by asking questions and by understanding that asking those questions may leave us in a position of vulnerability, that it is a position of vulnerability to acknowledge that we don't necessarily know everything, and that maybe our interpretation or maybe our judgment or maybe our concept, maybe it actually wasn't reflective of the truth. Perhaps it was reflective of the truth as we understood it at that moment, but maybe we've got more information at this time which is going to change our interpretation, and maybe we're going to evolve somewhat in terms of our thoughts.
I had this thought that came to mind, which you could say, well, Greg, that's something new for you. Nevertheless, I'm being truthful there. And so when they've done this in movies or in television shows, and they say, okay, we have this truth serum. We have to inject this into you because we need to get the truth out of you. So I'm thinking, okay, they do that. Well, before they do that, someone's saying whatever. And of course, the assumption is that they're not telling the truth. And so you inject the truth serum in them. And then the intention is that now magically, they're going to reveal the truth. So I was wondering myself, and out loud with you and anyone else, how do they know what comes out of the mouth is not the truth at that point? Because now it's the truth for them. How do they know it's not truthful either?
It's a very complicated.
Yeah, this is one of the world's biggest dilemmas, I think.
Well, it is very complicated because I think that calls to mind our own interpretation. So in your example of the truth serum, if that was, let's say, you in that situation, and we were talking about COVID as a situation, your interpretation of COVID might be your truth, but maybe that's just your interpretation. Maybe that's not necessarily reflective of the objective reality. So it does become a fairly dynamic, fairly fluid situation, and it can be very elusive as well. And I'm not sure I have the right answer, but I think that one of the places to start from is acknowledging the fact that maybe we don't know everything. And I think that's, as simple as that sounds, I think that that can be hard for people to relate to.
So what I really gather from what you just said is that you're being truthful in explaining your perspective of that, which is a good starting point.
I think it's important to acknowledge, for sure.
Yeah. And I just, there's a comment in the crowd there in the bleacher seats. I don't think there's a right answer. So, it all depends. Like we tend to use those two words. It depends, because there's a lot of things to factor and consider as part of the bigger picture. And then again, we talking about truth, and we play on the words here. There's only one version of truth. That's, of course, it's my truth. Well, that's a dilemma, because another person will see possibly the same thing from their own point of view and see their truth as being, quote, the real truth relative to whatever a perspective, because that's the type of language we try to promote in the world of conflict resolution, because truth is connected with fact, and that's the court system, judicial approach, justice. And when people live amongst each other, not everything is fact, or the perspectives of truth can vary, because each person processes it from their own lived experiences. So perspective is the non-judgmental piece that we try to put out there. What do you hope people listening, watching from this will gather or take from it or learn?
I think that it's important to be open-minded. I'm very much a firm believer. I keep going back to that idea of being open-minded. And I think in terms of those that are listening, I think it's important, even if it's just a small step, in terms of realizing that maybe I just don't know everything. Maybe I can learn something. Maybe there's something new that by speaking with such and such person that I may have had a disagreement with, maybe I can start asking some questions in terms of, what did the situation mean to you and how did it impact you? And separating the idea that it's not mutually exclusive, that their experience and their interpretation is not going to replace my own, it's not going to diminish my own. I think that is a pretty good place to start from in terms of this conversation. Just being a bit more open-minded is a good place.
So how truthful have you been for our conversation today?
I think completely truthful.
Because I leave that, total ownership rests with the individual. And that's my open-ended question. How truthful have you been? And not to imply there's any judgment in there.
Of course. I think I've been entirely truthful, Greg.
Well, we'll have to take it as it is, for sure. So what do you think I should do about the truth or truth? I'm putting it on you. Give me some options.
Well, Greg, I think that you would have to start asking yourself some questions in terms of, what is it that your relationship with the truth is? Why is it that you have that relationship? And what is it that your motivations are? And are you content with the situation that you're in? So assuming the answer is yes, then I would suggest that you carry on, keep going. If the answer is no, you're not content, then I would suggest that maybe that you could enact some of what we've spoken about tonight in terms of your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I'll have to reflect upon this. I'll have to review this. I'm really about self-determination and the individual having ownership of their own definition of what they want to do, and the steps they take and the steps they don't take. And so in a way, when I asked you that, of course I was being facetious in some way for people to understand. At the same time, it's a reflective piece and say, okay, I wanted to hear your perspective on that. The bottom line is, for me, and it's nothing personal, it's just I really don't care what another person feels about my sense of self. Because I think you would concur for yourself, that the true value is you determining that and defining and identifying that for yourself.
I do, and I think it's important also to be mindful. Sometimes we can improve at being self-aware, and by appreciating that, by not caring what our actions are doing to other people, because it confirms our own identity, I think that presents a bit of a dangerous proposition. And I think it's important to be self-aware in terms of what it is that we may be contributing to whatever the situation might be.
Yeah, basically the message for me is that I have responsibility for myself to take ownership for the decisions I make and the ones I don't make for myself. It's fully inclusive of me to consider and be self-aware that I don't live in this world alone. I function amongst other people. I am a social being. I like to interact in my way, like other people do in their way. And so it's the concept of consideration for another. That yes, we factor in that we're not alone and we live amongst people, and some of us want more privacy than others, that's different. That we have that consideration and acknowledge that other people may be looking at things differently from us, and that we need to seriously consider that. And ultimately, when we make a decision after considering that, we have to take responsibility and be accountable for the decisions we make. And again, if something is not working for us, we need to take some step to try to figure out how to make it work. That's my truth.
I would agree with you. I think it's important to be constructive, certainly. And I think what you've just described would contribute to being constructive.
Yeah, so we're at our closing time.
We are, Greg. Thank you very much for indulging me in terms of the topic of truth. Thanks very much for having me back. It's been great.
And I want to read a comment from the crowd again here. Very informative topic and quite hopeful in nature. Thank you so much for joining and being here tonight, Julie. And of course, thank you, everyone. Just put out a call there. Anybody in the crowd want to make a comment or ask questions before we say see you sometime soon? We're providing that consideration for another. This is our moment. Okay, no pressure. I want to acknowledge Laura, and I want to acknowledge Anthony as part of the team who are not in the forefront here, who are fundamental for me to be able to do what I'm doing, and then get our virtual of this, the recording in an edited format, so it's uploaded to Phantom Mediation, and then the links are sent out for people to access, because we do have a particular crowd here, and we would like to broaden to inform and educate others about, on a broader perspective, to get it out on social platforms. So I wanted to put out that nice word for Laura and Anthony. Appreciate it. And any closing comments, words, Julie?
I thank you, and Laura, thank you as well for this. And I hope that all of us leave this conversation being a little bit more open-minded and a little bit more truthful.
Yeah, for sure. It's a journey.
It is. It is.
It's a never-ending journey, because life is an evolving, transforming situation. And I think as we connect with our moments, we have to find a way to best connect with those, and then make it as positive and productive as it could be.
Excellent.
So we'll have to figure out something else for next time. And we're gonna, I don't know if it'll be about the truth or not.
We'll find out. We'll find out what it's about.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna say goodbye, and we're gonna magically transition into another world.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Greg. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate it too. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.